On Thanksgiving Day, my son asked why I froze his trust fund. I looked up from the mashed potatoes and stared at him across the dining table. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Then I saw my daughter-in-law slowly lower her wine glass. I saw the color leave her face. And I knew I hadn't misheard anything at all. What happened next changed the way I looked at my family forever. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. I always wonder how far these stories travel. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. Christmas belonged to children and bright wrapping paper. Easter belonged to church and flowers. But Thanksgiving belonged to memories. It belonged to recipes written on yellowing index cards. To the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey filling every corner of the house. To voices carrying through rooms that once felt too quiet. For 38 years I had hosted Thanksgiving dinner. 38 years. Even after my husband Arthur passed away 3 years ago, I kept doing it. Especially after he passed away. Because traditions become different when someone dies. At first they feel painful. Then they become anchors. I woke up that morning before sunrise. The house was still dark. Outside my kitchen window, the November sky looked cold and silver. Bare tree branches swayed against the early morning wind. I wrapped my cardigan tighter and started making coffee. The old coffee maker hissed and sputtered exactly the way Arthur used to complain about. I smiled at that. Funny how grief changes. In the beginning, every memory cuts like glass. Years later, some of them become small warm things you carry in your pocket. I stood there holding my mug and looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen Arthur and I had remodeled 20 years ago. The white cabinets. The oak floors. The little scratch near the refrigerator where our son Mason had crashed his bicycle indoors when he was 8. I never fixed that scratch. Arthur used to say, "Leave it. Houses should remember people." I ran my fingers across it as I walked by. Then I got to work. Turkey in the oven. Sweet potatoes. Green bean casserole. Homemade rolls. Pumpkin pie cooling near the window. By 10 in the morning the whole house smelled like butter and cinnamon. For the first time in weeks it didn't feel empty. Mason was coming. My grandson Ethan was coming. My daughter-in-law Claire was coming. Family. That's what I kept telling myself. Family. Around noon they started arriving. Ethan burst through the front door first. "Grandma!" He practically tackled me with a hug. At 10 years old he had Arthur's eyes. That same warm brown color. That same smile. I kissed the top of his head. "My goodness," I said. "You've gotten taller again." He grinned. "I'm almost 5 feet now." "Slow down," I said. "I'm trying to keep up." Behind him came Mason. My son leaned down and hugged me quickly. Too quickly. I noticed that immediately. Mothers notice things. Always. He smelled expensive now. Cologne. Leather. Something sharp and unfamiliar. Not like the boy who used to run through this house smelling like grass and soap. Then Claire walked in. She smiled and handed me a bottle of wine. "Happy Thanksgiving, Evelyn." Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. Perfect voice. Claire always looked put together. Even on ordinary days. I hugged her. She hugged me back. But something felt strange. Small. Almost invisible. Her body felt stiff. Like she wasn't really there. I brushed the feeling away. "You're imagining things, Evelyn. People get tired. People get stressed. Families change." Dinner started around 4. Everyone laughed. Ethan talked about school. Claire talked about a vacation they wanted to take next spring. Mason talked about business. I nodded and smiled and passed dishes around the table. Outside, evening slowly settled over the neighborhood. Inside, candles flickered across the dining room table. Everything looked normal. Everything looked warm. Everything looked exactly the way Thanksgiving was supposed to look. Then Mason set down his fork. He looked at me. Actually looked at me. And something inside my chest tightened. Because suddenly he looked nervous. "Mom." I looked up. "Yes, sweetheart." He cleared his throat. "Can I ask you something?" I smiled. "Of course." He glanced toward Claire. Just for a second. But I saw it. Then he looked back at me. "Why did you freeze my trust fund?" Silence. Absolute silence. Even Ethan stopped eating. I stared at him. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Cold. Wrong. Trust fund? I blinked once. Then twice. Slowly I turned toward Claire. Her hand tightened around her wine glass. And for the first time all day, she wouldn't look at me. I felt something shift. Not outside. Inside me. Something quiet. Something cold. Because suddenly I remembered the notification I'd gotten from my home security system 3 nights earlier. The one I'd ignored. The one that said, motion detected in office hallway, 11:43 p.m. And suddenly, I wanted to see that footage. I barely heard the rest of dinner after that. The room was still full of sounds. Forks touching plates. Ethan quietly sipping apple cider. The faint hum of the dishwasher from the kitchen. But suddenly everything felt distant. As if I were underwater. I looked at Mason carefully. My son shifted in his chair and forced a small laugh. You know, he said, reaching for his glass. The trust fund. I said nothing. Because I had no idea what he was talking about. Arthur and I had established several financial accounts over the years. Retirement funds. Savings accounts. Investments. And yes, years ago we'd created a trust fund structure. But I had never frozen anything. Not recently. Not ever. I folded my napkin neatly in my lap. Sweetheart, I said softly. What trust fund are you talking about? For a moment Mason simply stared at me. Confusion crossed his face. Real confusion. Then slowly that confusion changed. His eyebrows pulled together. What do you mean? I kept my voice calm. Mason, I don't know what you're talking about. Claire finally spoke. Oh, just one word. But something about it felt rehearsed. Like someone stepping onto a stage after missing their cue. She leaned forward slightly. I thought maybe you didn't want to discuss financial matters in front of Ethan. I looked at her. Her smile stayed perfectly in place. But her eyes looked different. Nervous. Very nervous. I had spent 70 years watching faces. Watching children lie about broken lamps. Watching neighbors pretend marriages were fine. Watching Arthur insist he wasn't sick even after chemotherapy had exhausted him. You learn things over time. People lie with words. But bodies tell the truth. Bodies always tell the truth. Claire reached for her wine again. Except her hand missed the glass slightly before finding it. Small thing. Tiny thing. But I noticed. Mason looked back and forth between us. No. Mom, I mean the family trust. Family trust. Those words settled into my chest like cold rain. Arthur had created that trust 6 months before he died. I still remembered sitting beside him in the attorney's office. Rain tapping against the windows. Arthur holding my hand. You'll manage it, he'd said quietly. I trust you more than anyone. I remember laughing through tears. You realize I'm terrible with paperwork. He smiled. No. He squeezed my hand. You're terrible at saying no. At the time I thought he was joking. Now, sitting at my Thanksgiving table 3 years later, I wasn't so sure. Mason, I said carefully, why are you asking me this tonight? Silence. He looked surprised. As if the question itself had caught him off guard. Claire answered before he could. Oh, no reason. No reason. People who tell the truth usually have reasons. People hiding things usually don't. I looked toward Ethan. My grandson had gone back to eating his mashed potatoes, completely unaware of the tension hanging over the room. I was grateful for that. Children shouldn't carry adult burdens. Arthur used to say that too. I stood slowly. Would anyone like more coffee? Claire immediately stood. I'll help. Too fast. Much too fast. I smiled politely. No, dir. Sit. For the first time all evening her smile slipped. Just for a second. Then it returned. I walked into the kitchen carrying empty dishes. My hands moved automatically. Rinse. Stack. Dry. Normal movements. But my mind wasn't in that kitchen anymore. It had gone somewhere else. 3 nights earlier. 11:43 p.m. Motion detected in office hallway. I remembered seeing the notification on my phone while sitting in bed reading. I almost checked it. Almost. Then I remembered Ethan was spending the weekend at Mason's house, and assumed maybe I'd forgotten to turn the system off. I dismissed it. Simple mistake. Nothing more. I stared out the kitchen window. Darkness had completely settled outside now. My backyard looked quiet beneath the porch lights. Still. Cold. I suddenly felt cold too. Behind me I heard footsteps. Mason. Mom. I turned around. He looked uncomfortable. Like he had when he was 14 and trying to explain why his report card had 3 missing assignments. I didn't upset you, did I? I forced a smile. No. You seem quiet. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Gray sweater. Little lines beside his eyes now. 42 years old. My little boy. My only child. I remembered holding him after nightmares. Helping him with homework. Sitting. Through baseball games in summer heat. I remembered Arthur teaching him how to ride a bike in the driveway. I remembered believing no matter how old he got, I would always know him. Now I wasn't so sure. I touched his arm gently. Sweetheart, I asked quietly, who told you I froze anything? For a second, just 1 second, his face went completely blank. Then I watched him glance toward the dining room, toward Claire. And that was when I felt it. That strange little feeling. That cold feeling. The same feeling you get when you walk into your house and realize something has been moved, but you can't yet tell what. And suddenly I knew exactly what I was going to do after everyone left. I was going upstairs. I was opening my office. And I was finally going to watch the security footage from 3 nights ago. Dinner ended an hour later. Claire insisted on helping with dishes. Mason helped Ethan put on his jacket. Everything looked normal again. That was the strange part. People think betrayal arrives like thunder, like shouting, like slammed doors and broken glass. But sometimes it arrives wearing a smile and carrying a casserole dish. Sometimes it sits across from you at Thanksgiving dinner and asks if you'd like more gravy. I stood at the front door as they prepared to leave. Ethan wrapped his arms around me again. Bye, Grandma. I kissed his forehead. Be good for your parents. He grinned. I am good. I smiled. Children always say that with such confidence. Then Mason hugged me. Another quick hug. Again too quick. You okay, Mom? I looked at him for a moment. His face looked tired. Maybe worried. Maybe guilty. I couldn't tell anymore. I'm fine, sweetheart. Claire stepped forward next. She wrapped her arms around me gently. You did too much today, she said warmly. You should rest. Rest. Something about the word stayed with me. Because suddenly I remembered Arthur saying almost the same thing 3 years ago. 2 weeks before he died. Take care of yourself, Evie. I used to think grief softened over time. Maybe it does. But some nights it returns without warning. Some nights it sits beside you in an empty house. I watched their car disappear down the street. Then everything became quiet. Completely quiet. The kind of silence only widows really understand. Locked the front door. Turned off the dining room lights. Covered the leftover pumpkin pie. Folded kitchen towels. Small things. Ordinary things. The sort of things you do when your mind is trying not to think. But my mind was thinking. Thinking hard. I kept hearing Mason's voice. Why did you freeze my trust fund? Not our trust. Not Dad's trust. My trust fund. I walked slowly upstairs. The hallway felt darker than usual. Arthur's photograph still sat on the small table near our bedroom door. Same silver frame. Same warm smile. I stopped beside it. Sometimes I still talked to him. Not because I thought he'd answer. Just because after 39 years of marriage, silence feels unnatural. I touched the frame lightly. You always saw things before I did, I whispered. Then I smiled sadly. Help me out here. The office sat at the end of the hallway. Arthur used to spend hours in there, paying bills, reading newspapers, pretending he understood computers better than I did. After he passed away, I changed very little. His leather chair was still there. His desk lamp, even his favorite coffee mug sat beside the bookshelf. World's best dad. Mason had given it to him when he was 10. I turned on the light. Soft yellow light filled the room. Everything looked normal. Perfectly normal. I sat at the desk and opened my laptop. The security system app loaded slowly. My fingers suddenly felt cold. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. I almost laughed at myself. What exactly was I expecting? A stranger breaking into my house? Some teenager cutting through the backyard? Probably nothing. Probably a false alarm. I clicked notifications. November 23rd. 11:43 p.m. Motion detected, office hallway. I pressed play. Black and white footage appeared on the screen. The hallway outside my office looked empty. Nothing moved. I watched for several seconds. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. I exhaled. See, Evelyn? You're imagining things. I reached for the mouse. Then movement appeared. A shadow. Someone walking carefully into frame. I froze. Because I knew that walk. Mothers always know. Even from shadows. Even from silhouettes. Even after 40 years. Mason. My son stepped into the hallway and looked around. My heart gave one hard beat. Then another. No. No, sweetheart. No. He moved toward my office door. Then stopped. A few seconds later. Someone else walked into frame. Claire. I stared at the screen. Neither of them looked frightened. Neither looked confused. They looked careful. Deliberate. Claire leaned close to Mason and said something. No audio. Only movement. Then I watched my son reach into his pocket and pull out something metallic. I leaned closer. House keys. My house keys. The spare set I kept hidden downstairs. I felt the blood drain from my face. Slowly, carefully, Mason unlocked my office door. And then both of them disappeared inside. I stared at the screen without breathing. Because suddenly one terrifying thought entered my mind. I hadn't been robbed. Someone hadn't broken into my house. I had invited them in years ago. And I was suddenly afraid of what they had come looking for. I sat there staring at the screen for what felt like several minutes. Maybe it was 30 seconds. Maybe 5 minutes. I honestly couldn't tell. The house around me had become completely silent. No dishes clinking downstairs. No television. No footsteps. Just the faint hum of my desk lamp and the sound of my own breathing. Mason and Claire had entered my office at nearly midnight, using hidden spare keys. Without telling me. Without calling. Without any reason I could understand. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the desk. Then I pressed play again. Slowly. This time I watched every movement. Mason stepped inside first. Claire followed behind him. The office camera itself didn't show much of the room because I'd originally installed it only after Arthur passed away. Living alone changes you. You start noticing small things. Strange sounds at night. Cars parked too long outside. News stories that suddenly feel more personal. The camera mainly covered the desk area and part of the bookshelves. I never imagined I would end up using it to watch my own family. Mason walked toward Arthur's old desk. Toward me. Toward the place where I kept important documents. Claire stayed near the doorway. Watching. Looking over her shoulder. Waiting. Waiting for what? For me? For neighbors? For someone to catch them? I leaned closer. Mason sat in Arthur's chair. Arthur's chair. Something about that bothered me more than it should have. Maybe because some small part of me still expected no one else to sit there. Silly things become sacred after loss. People don't always understand that. I watched my son open the top desk drawer. Then the second drawer. Then the third. Not randomly. Not curiously. Purposefully. Like he already knew what he wanted. Coldness spread slowly through my chest. No. No. Mason knew that desk. Of course he did. He'd grown up in this house. As a child, he'd sit on Arthur's lap while Arthur paid bills. He used to steal paper clips and pretend they were tiny swords. I suddenly remembered something. A memory I hadn't thought about in years. Mason at 9 years old. Standing in this very room. Arthur holding up a folder. Someday this will all belong to you, buddy. Mason had grinned. Everything. Arthur laughed. No. He ruffled his hair. Not everything. Then he pointed toward me. Grandma's antique dishes are off limits. I smiled despite myself. Back then we'd all laughed. Back then money had simply been money. Not something that sat between people. Not something that changed them. On screen, Mason continued opening drawers. Nothing dramatic. Nothing violent. Just quiet searching. Almost worse somehow. Then Claire moved. She walked over beside him and leaned down. She pointed toward something. Toward the small cabinet beside the bookshelf. My stomach tightened immediately. No. Arthur's files. Arthur kept personal files there. Insurance papers. Legal documents. Trust paperwork. Property records. I watched Mason stand and walk directly toward it. Directly. No hesitación. No searching. He knew exactly where to go. I sat back slowly, because suddenly another memory surfaced. 3 months ago. Sunday dinner. Claire standing in my kitchen, smiling while drying dishes. Casual voice. Casual question. Arthur handled all the finances, right? I remember laughing. Mostly. Then she'd asked. It must be hard learning all of it now. At the time I'd thought nothing of it. Absolutely nothing. People ask harmless questions every day. Families talk. Families share things. But suddenly more memories started appearing. Little things. Tiny things. Claire asking whether I still kept paper records. Mason asking if I'd updated my will after Arthur passed away. Claire wondering if I still used the same bank. Questions. Always small questions. Always harmless. Puzzle pieces. That's what they felt like now. Puzzle pieces clicking together. I looked back at the screen. Mason had opened the cabinet. Claire moved closer. Then suddenly both of them stopped moving. They stared downward at something I couldn't see. Claire said something. I couldn't hear it. But I saw her expression change. Her eyes widened. Mason looked at her. Then looked back down. Then he smiled. A small smile. A smile I hadn't seen before. Not happiness. Not relief. Something else. Something colder. Then Mason reached inside and pulled out a thick blue folder. My heart stopped, because I knew exactly what that folder was. Arthur's family trust documents. And suddenly I realized they hadn't come into my office to look around. They had come for something specific. Something they already knew existed. Top of form, I stared at the blue folder on the screen and felt my stomach sink. Arthur's family trust documents. There was no possibility of mistake. I knew that folder. I had bought it myself years ago at an office supply store 3 miles from our house. Arthur used to joke that I always chose boring colors. Blue, he'd laughed. You picked blue for documents worth half our lives? I told him blue felt dependable. Funny the things you remember. Funny the things that stay with you. On the screen, Mason slowly opened the folder. Claire moved beside him. Both of them leaned over the desk. Reading. Studying. Looking through pages that didn't belong to them. I sat completely still. I wasn't angry yet. That surprised me. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was simply watching. Watching the same way you stare out a car window after hearing terrible news. Your brain hears it, but your heart hasn't caught up. Not yet. I pressed my fingers against my lips. Mason turned pages slowly, then stopped. Claire pointed at something. Again I couldn't hear them. No audio. Only movements. Only faces. But faces can say a lot. Claire suddenly looked excited. Actually excited. She crossed her arms and leaned closer. Mason nodded. Then he smiled again. That same smile. I hated that smile. Because I didn't recognize it. Children spend their whole lives learning their parents. Parents spend their whole lives believing they know their children. Sometimes both people are wrong. I kept watching. Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He took pictures. 1 page. Then another. Then another. My breathing stopped. No. No, sweetheart. Please don't do this. He kept going. Click. 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 Photographing every page carefully. Claire looked toward the hallway. Then back at him. She looked nervous. Mason didn't. That hurt more than I expected. Claire had only been part of our family for 8 years. But Mason was my son. I remembered another Thanksgiving. 28 years ago. Mason was 14. Arthur had accidentally burned the turkey. Completely ruined it. Black smoke everywhere. The kitchen smelled terrible. I thought Thanksgiving was destroyed. I remember standing there frustrated and exhausted. Then Mason walked into the kitchen carrying 2 frozen pizzas from the garage freezer. Guess we're having Italian Thanksgiving, he'd said. Arthur laughed so hard he nearly cried. We ate pizza that year. Sat around the table laughing until midnight. It became one of our favorite memories. Back then Mason had been kind. gentle, good-hearted. So where had that boy gone? I stared at the screen. Mason suddenly stopped taking photos. Claire said something, then pointed toward the lower section of the cabinet. Mason looked down. For a moment his face changed. Confused. He bent lower, then started searching again. Moving papers, opening drawers, looking behind files, looking under folders, searching hard. I frowned, because suddenly I realized something. They weren't finished. The trust documents weren't the only thing they wanted. They were looking for something else. Something important. Something they expected to find. I sat up straighter. Then I remembered. 6 months earlier, Arthur's attorney, Daniel Reeves, had called me. We'd gone over estate documents and updated some paperwork. At the end of the meeting, he handed me a sealed envelope. Arthur wanted this kept separate, he had said. Separate from everything else. I remember staring at it. What is it? Daniel smiled softly. Just follow Arthur's instructions. I had placed the envelope inside the lower cabinet drawer, behind several old insurance folders. Then I completely forgot about it. Until now. Oh my God. My eyes widened. No. I looked back at the screen. Mason was opening that exact drawer. Claire leaned beside him. Both of them looked frustrated. Then suddenly Claire grabbed his arm. She pointed directly toward the back, toward where the envelope had been hidden. And slowly, very slowly, Mason reached his hand inside. Then his face changed, because the envelope was gone. I felt my heartbeat stop, because I suddenly remembered something terrifying. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it. So if it wasn't there anymore, who had taken it? I stared at the screen without moving. The envelope was gone. Not misplaced. Not hidden under another stack of papers. Gone. Mason searched again. He pulled out folders, lifted old documents, opened drawers. Claire moved beside him, her face tightening with frustration. They were definitely looking for something specific, and they definitely weren't finding it. For some reason, that realization sent a strange feeling through me. Relief. Small relief. But underneath it, fear. Because now I had a different question. If Mason and Claire hadn't taken the envelope, then who had? I sat back slowly. The desk chair creaked beneath me. My mind felt heavy. I closed my eyes and tried to think. Think carefully. Think slowly. Arthur always used to tell me that panic made people stupid. Slow down, Evie. People miss the truth when they're scared. So I took a breath. Then another. Who had entered my office recently? Not Mason. Not Claire. At least not legally. I rarely invited anyone upstairs anymore. Most of my life happened downstairs now. Kitchen. Living room. Back porch. I opened my eyes. Then another memory surfaced. Tuesday. 3 days before Thanksgiving. My cleaning service had come. Linda had worked for me almost 5 years. Sweet woman. 58 years old. Talked constantly about her grandchildren. No. Not Linda. Impossible. Then I remembered Daniel, Arthur's attorney. He had stopped by 2 weeks earlier to drop off updated tax documents. He'd come upstairs briefly because I couldn't remember where I'd left some paperwork. But Daniel had known Arthur for 20 years. Arthur trusted him. I trusted him. No, not Daniel either. I looked back at the paused security footage. Mason was still frozen on screen beside the cabinet, his hand inside the drawer. Claire staring beside him. Then suddenly I noticed something. Something very small. I leaned closer. Claire's eyes. She wasn't looking at the drawer anymore. She was looking at Mason. Watching him. Carefully. Very carefully. I frowned. Then rewound. 10 seconds. Played it again. Claire points. Mason reaches inside. Mason realizes something is missing. Then before Mason reacts, Claire looks at him. Not surprised. Not confused. Watching. Waiting. My stomach tightened. I replayed it again. Then again. And suddenly I felt cold. Very cold. Because Claire didn't look like someone discovering unexpected news. She looked like someone checking whether another person had discovered unexpected news. There was a difference. A big difference. I stared at her face. Years of little moments suddenly started drifting through my mind. Claire asking questions. Claire remembering details I barely remembered myself. Claire always steering conversations around money in strange little ways. Not obvious. Never obvious. Subtle. Arthur used to call people like that quiet fishermen. They don't throw nets, he'd say. They drop lines and wait. I remember laughing when he said it years ago. Now I wasn't laughing. I looked at the screen again. Mason suddenly turned toward Claire and said something. No audio. But I knew my son. I knew his expressions. He looked confused, frustrated, lost. Claire answered quickly. Too quickly. Then she touched his arm. Smiled. That smile. Perfect. Calm. Reassuring. The same smile she'd worn all through Thanksgiving dinner. The same smile she'd worn at birthdays. Christmas mornings. Family vacations. I suddenly wondered something that made my chest tighten. How long? How long had this been happening? How long had I not seen it? 1 year? 2? Longer? I swallowed hard. Then the footage continued. Claire said something else. Mason nodded. And then, he did something that made my blood run cold. He took out his phone again, opened something, then held the screen toward Claire. I leaned closer. Closer. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but I could see enough. Numbers. Charts. Account information. Bank information. And at the top I saw my own name. Evelyn Harper. My heart stopped, because suddenly I understood something terrifying. They hadn't come looking for old paperwork. They weren't searching out of curiosity. They already had information. Detailed information. Enough information to know exactly where to look. Enough information to know what existed. Enough information to ask about a trust fund at Thanksgiving dinner. I stared at the screen. Then I whispered into the empty room. Who gave them that information? And suddenly, I wasn't only afraid of what Mason and Claire were doing anymore. I was afraid someone else was involved. I sat in Arthur's office long after the footage ended. The screen had gone dark. My reflection stared back at me now. 70 years old. Silver hair falling loosely around my shoulders. Tired eyes. A woman sitting alone in the middle of the night, discovering that the people she loved might be strangers. I looked older somehow. Not because of wrinkles. Not because of time. Because betrayal ages you differently. It adds weight where nobody can see it. I closed the laptop slowly. No sudden movements. No panique. No tears. Arthur always believed emotions had their place. But he also believed timing mattered. Never make decisions while you're hurt, Evie. Hurt people confuse pain with truth. I used to roll my eyes whenever he said things like that. Now I wished he were sitting beside me. I wished I could hear his voice. I wished he could tell me what to do. But the room stayed quiet. Only silence answered me. I stood and walked toward the bookshelf. Arthur's old books still sat there. History books. Biographies. Financial magazines he never threw away. I ran my fingers across the shelves absent-mindedly. Thinking hard. Mason and Claire knew too much. Way too much. The trust. The office. The cabinet. The documents. None of that information should have existed outside this room. Not unless someone had told them. Or unless someone had shown them. I stopped moving. Then slowly looked back at Arthur's desk. Showed them. My eyes narrowed. No. Wait. I walked back toward the laptop and opened the security system again. Not the hallway footage this time. The activity history. I started scrolling. November 23rd. November 22nd. November 18th. Motion alerts. Door activity. Garage notifications. Nothing unusual. Then November 3rd. My hand froze. Front door open 2:14 p.m. I frowned. Why did I not remember that? Clicked it. The video loaded. There I was leaving the house that afternoon. Right. I remembered now. Hair appointment. I had gone downtown. I kept watching. 30 minutes passed on the footage. Nothing. Then suddenly the front door opened again. My heart skipped. Claire walked inside. Alone. I stared at the screen. No. No. Maybe Mason was behind her. Maybe Ethan. Maybe no. Nobody. Just Claire. She walked in casually, like someone entering her own house. No hesitación. No knocking. No confusión. Straight inside. I stared. My brain struggled to catch up. Why was she here? I wasn't home. Mason wasn't here. Nobody had mentioned this visit. I watched her take off her coat, set down her purse, then walk directly toward the stairs. Not the kitchen. Not the living room. Not looking for me. Straight upstairs. Straight toward my office. I felt cold spread through my chest. Because people wandering through unfamiliar houses hesitate. People looking for bathrooms hesitate. People looking for someone call out. Claire didn't. She knew exactly where she was going. Exactly where. Clicked ahead. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. 20. No sign. Of her. She stayed upstairs. Inside my office. 23 minutes later she came back down. Calm. Perfectly calm. She picked up her purse. Put on her coat. Smiled at something on her phone. Then left. I stared at the screen. My mouth had gone dry. 23 minutes. 23 minutes alone inside Arthur's office. I replayed it. Again. And again. Maybe I missed something. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe then I noticed it. Right before she reached the front door. Claire stopped, reached into her purse, and pulled out a folded white envelope. My breathing stopped. Because I knew that envelope. I knew it instantly. Cream-colored paper. Blue stripe across the edge. Arthur's handwriting. I had seen it 2 weeks earlier. Daniel had handed it to me himself. Arthur wanted this kept separate. The envelope. The missing envelope. Claire looked down at it. Smiled. Then placed it back into her purse. And walked out the front door. I sat completely still. Because suddenly one thing became painfully clear. Mason had no idea the envelope was gone. But Claire did. Claire already knew. And whatever was inside that envelope, she had taken it weeks ago. Top of form, I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. I sat in Arthur's office until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at the dark laptop screen. Claire had taken the envelope. Not Mason. Claire. Somehow strangely that hurt and relieved me at the same time. Relieved because my son hadn't stolen it. Hurt because he was still standing right beside her. Arthur used to say something about loyalty. People don't always betray you themselves, Evie. Sometimes they just stand beside the people who do. At the time I thought he was talking about business. Now I wasn't so sure. Around 4 in the morning I finally went downstairs. The house felt enormous. Empty houses always feel larger at night. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted turkey. Dishes sat drying beside the sink. Ethan's forgotten paper napkin still rested beside his chair. Everything looked normal. But normal had started feeling like a costume. I made coffee. Strong coffee. The kind Arthur called heart attack coffee. I smiled sadly remembering that. Then I sat at the kitchen table and started writing things down. Not feelings. Facts. Just facts. Arthur had always done that. When problems happened he wrote things down. Emotion later. Facts first. I found an old notebook inside a drawer. Then I wrote. November 3rd. Claire enters house alone 23 minutes upstairs leaves carrying Arthur envelope November 23rd. Mason and Claire enter office search for trust documents search for missing envelope Mason appears confused Claire appears prepared I stared at the list. Then I noticed something strange. Very strange. I read it again. Mason looked confused. Actually confused. Not pretending. I replayed his face in my mind. The searching. The frustration. The surprise when the envelope wasn't there. I leaned back slowly. Because suddenly another thought appeared. What if Mason wasn't the one leading this? What if he wasn't the one asking questions? What if no? I stopped myself. Mothers make dangerous mistakes sometimes. We excuse our children. We protect them. We rewrite ugly truths into prettier stories. I wasn't going to do that. Not now. Still. The question stayed. Around 8 that morning my phone rang. I looked down. Daniel Reeves. Arthur's attorney. I stared at the screen. Then answered. Hello. Evelyn. Daniel's voice sounded warm as always. Happy Thanksgiving weekend. Thank you. A brief silence followed. Then. I hope I didn't wake you. I looked at my untouched coffee. No. I've been awake. You sound tired. I almost laughed. Tired. That was one word for it. Daniel continued. I actually called because I wanted to remind you about Monday. Monday. For a second my brain felt completely blank. Then I remembered. The annual trust review meeting. Arthur had insisted on yearly reviews. Every single year. Even after his death. Daniel believed it helped prevent legal problems later. Right, I said quietly. Monday. 2 o'clock. I rubbed my forehead. Thank you. Another pause. Then Daniel said, oh, and one more thing. My hand stopped moving. There was a request last week. I sat upright immediately. A request. Regarding access information for trust records. My heart began beating harder. Very slowly I asked, what kind of request? Daniel hesitated. It struck me as odd. I said nothing. It came from Mason. Silence. Everything inside me went still. Completely still. Because suddenly I remembered Mason standing beside the cabinet. Searching. Confused. And then I remembered Claire. Watching him. Watching his reaction. My grip tightened around the phone. Daniel continued carefully. He claimed you wanted him added as an authorized contact. I felt cold. Ice cold. No. My voice came out almost as a whisper. No, I never asked for that. Daniel became quiet. Then, I thought that might be the case. I closed my eyes, and suddenly a terrifying thought entered my mind. If Mason really made that request, then why had he looked so confused during the footage? Unless someone had made that request using his name. My eyes opened slowly, and for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I wasn't thinking about trust funds anymore. I was thinking about Claire. Monday arrived cold and gray. The kind of morning Arthur used to call indoor weather. Clouds hung low over the neighborhood, and thin rain tapped softly against the windows while I stood in my bedroom staring at my closet. For some reason I couldn't decide what to wear. Ridiculous thing to worry about. After everything I'd seen over the last 2 days, I was standing there wondering whether to wear navy blue or gray. Maybe that's what people do when their lives begin falling apart. They hold on to small decisions because bigger ones feel impossible. I finally chose navy. Arthur always liked navy. Makes you look dangerous, he teased. I smiled faintly at the memory. Then the smile disappeared. By 1:30 I was sitting inside Daniel Reeves' office. Same leather chairs. Same framed certificates on cream-colored walls. I'd been here dozens of times over the years. With Arthur. Without Arthur. But today felt different. Today I felt like I was waiting for test results at a hospital. Daniel walked in carrying a folder. Evelyn. He smiled gently and sat down across from me. You doing all right? No. Not even close. But I smiled anyway. I'm fine. People over 60 become very good at saying that. We're tired? Fine. Lonely? Fine. Heartbroken? Still fine. Daniel studied me for a moment, then slowly opened the folder. We'll go over annual trust matters first. I nodded. Words blurred together after that. Investments. Returns. Accounts. Numbers floated around me like background noise. Then Daniel paused. His expression changed slightly. Evelyn. I looked up. There's something else. My stomach tightened immediately. He turned a few pages, then slid a document across the desk toward me. I stared down. At first nothing looked strange. Legal language. Names. Signatures. Dates. Then I saw it. My name. And directly underneath, requests for secondary authorized access. I stopped breathing, because beneath that was Mason's name. I stared at it, then stared harder. No. Daniel watched quietly. He submitted this online 10 days ago. 10 days. 10 days before Thanksgiving. 10 days before the office footage. Slowly I looked up. He actually filed it? Daniel frowned slightly. That's what concerns me. I looked back down. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. I couldn't explain it immediately, but something was pulling at me. Something small. I leaned closer. Closer. Then suddenly my heartbeat stopped, because I recognized the signature. Not Mason's. Mine. My signature. Or at least, something pretending to be my signature. I had signed thousands of things in my life. Checks, school forms, mortgage papers, birthday cards. I knew my own handwriting. And this wasn't it. Close. Very close. But wrong. The E curved differently. The H looked rushed. Tiny differences. Tiny. But real. I looked up slowly. Daniel was already watching me. You see it. It wasn't a question. I nodded. That's not mine. Silence. Daniel leaned back. I thought so. My mouth felt dry. Then I whispered. Someone forged my signature. Daniel didn't answer immediately, because he didn't need to. We were both thinking the same thing. 10 days ago. Unauthorized access request. Claire entering my house alone. Missing envelope. Questions about the trust. Security footage. Everything suddenly started moving together, like gears finally connecting. Then Daniel opened another folder. I wasn't going to bring this up unless necessary. My eyes lifted. He slid another paper toward me. This was submitted 3 days later. I looked down, then felt every drop of blood leave my face. Because this time, the request wasn't for access. It was for an early distribution review. Requested beneficiary, Mason Harper. Requested amount, $480,000. I stared at the page. Nearly $500,000. $500,000. Then I saw the reason listed beneath it. Family housing investment. Housing investment. I looked up immediately. Mason never said anything about buying property. Daniel's face had gone very serious. No. He paused. He didn't. The room suddenly felt smaller. Much smaller. Because only 2 possibilities existed now. Either my son had been lying to me for weeks, or someone had been using my son's name. And somehow, I was beginning to fear I already knew which answer was true. I drove home from Daniel's office in complete silence. No radio. No music. No phone calls. Just windshield wipers moving slowly across the glass. Back and forth. Back and forth. Rain blurred the streets outside into gray shapes and streaks of light. I barely noticed traffic. Barely noticed anything. My hands stayed tight around the steering wheel the entire drive. Because my mind kept replaying one number. $480,000. $500,000. Requested in Mason's name. Supported by forged documents. My documents. My signature. My family. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for several minutes. The house looked exactly the same. White shutters. Brick walkway. Arthur's old wind chime moving softly beside the porch. Normal. Everything looked normal. I was beginning to hate that word. Normal. Because normal had become dangerous. Normal had hidden things from me. Normal had smiled at me across Thanksgiving dinner. I finally walked inside. The house greeted me with silence. I took off my coat and placed my purse on the kitchen counter. Then I stood there, still, thinking. No panique. No crying. No yelling. Just thinking. Because for the first time since Thanksgiving something had changed. Before today I only had suspicions. Pieces. Questions. Now I had proof. Not complete proof. But enough. Enough to stop feeling confused. Enough to stop doubting myself. Arthur used to say, truth changes people. Not because truth hurts. Because once you know it, you can't unknow it. I suddenly understood exactly what he meant. I walked upstairs, straight to my office, opened the laptop, opened the security footage again. I watched Claire leave with the envelope. Again. Watched Mason searching for it. Again. Watched Claire watching Mason. Again. Then I paused the footage and stared at her face. Calm. Controlled. Watching. Always watching. Then suddenly something struck me. Something I should have noticed before. I leaned closer. Very close. Claire was carrying her large brown purse. Same purse she brought to Thanksgiving. Same purse she carried almost everywhere. And hanging from the side I froze. Because attached beside the zipper was a small silver keychain. A little metal lighthouse. I knew that keychain. I knew it immediately. 2 years earlier, Mason and Claire had taken Ethan to Cape Cod for vacation. Ethan bought matching lighthouse keychains at a gift shop. One for Claire. One for Mason. One for me. I still had mine attached to my house keys downstairs. I stared harder, because hanging beside the lighthouse was something else. A key. A small gold key. Very small. Not a house key. Not a car key. I frowned, then suddenly remembered something. 3 weeks ago, I had gone to the bank. Arthur's safety deposit box. After his death, I only checked it once or twice each year. Mostly paperwork. Military records. Property documents. Old letters. I remembered standing at the counter while the bank manager smiled apologetically. Looks like your box was already accessed recently, Mrs. Harper. At the time I hadn't thought much about it. I assumed I had forgotten. At 70, forgetting little things happens. I remember laughing. Looks like I'm losing my memory. The manager laughed too. Happens to all of us. I had completely forgotten that conversation. Until now. My stomach dropped. No. The safety deposit box key. Arthur's box had a small gold key. Exactly that size. Exactly. I sat back slowly, because suddenly another terrifying thought entered my mind. Claire hadn't stolen paperwork from my office. She hadn't stopped there. If that was Arthur's key, then she had gone somewhere else too. Somewhere much bigger. Somewhere much more dangerous. Then my phone rang. I looked down. Mason. For several seconds I stared at his name, then answered. Isuadhart. Silence. Then, Mom. His voice sounded strange. Tight. Unsteady. Did you do something today? I felt my heartbeat slow. Very slowly I said. What do you mean? Silence again. Then he whispered. My bank called. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I knew the game had finally started. My eyes stayed closed for a moment. Mason's voice sounded different. Not angry. Not confident. Scared. Genuinely scared. I sat very still in Arthur's office. Outside the window, rain continued falling softly against the glass. For the first time in days, I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity, because fear sounds different depending on who's carrying it. Claire's fear had always sounded controlled, careful, strategic. Mason's fear sounded real. Mom. His voice pulled me back. Did you do something? I opened my eyes slowly. What happened, sweetheart? Silence. I heard him breathing. Then, my bank account got flagged. I frowned. Flagged. Someone from fraud prevention called me this morning. My heartbeat slowed. Very slowly. Fraud prevention. Interesting. Very interesting. Mason continued. They said they needed to verify recent activity. His voice became tighter. They asked me about large financial requests. I said nothing, because suddenly Daniel's words came back to me. Early distribution request. $480,000. Mason exhaled sharply. Mom. What is going on? I looked out the office window. Arthur planted maple trees in the backyard years ago. Most leaves had already fallen. Only a few remain now. Holding on. Barely. I have a question first, I said quietly. Silence. Then, okay. I leaned back in the chair. Did you submit a request for nearly $500,000 from the family trust? Nothing. Absolute silence. No breathing. No movement. Nothing. Then, what? One word. One small word. But mothers know their children. Always. And that wasn't the voice of a man pretending surprise. That was shock. Real shock. Mason. My voice stayed calm. Very calm. Did you request money? No. He almost shouted it. No, Mom. What are you talking about? I closed my eyes again, because suddenly something painful happened. Something I hadn't expected. Relief. Relief hit me so hard my chest actually hurt. Not complete relief. Not forgiveness. Not innocence. But relief. Because for days I had been carrying one terrible possibility. My son had become someone I no longer recognized. Now that possibility had started cracking. Just slightly. Mason, I said carefully, I need you to answer something honestly. I am. No. I swallowed. Honestly. Silence. Then, okay. I stared at Arthur's desk. At his coffee mug. at his old reading glasses still sitting beside the lamp. Why were you in my office Thanksgiving week? Dead silence. Complete silence. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then, what? Coldness moved through me. Mason. His breathing changed immediately. Faster now. Mom. Mason. I can explain. I shut my eyes, because those 4 words, those 4 horrible words, never lead anywhere good. I knew it, he said quietly. Knew what? Long pause. Then his voice dropped. Claire told me. I stopped breathing. She said you were changing things. My grip tightened around the phone. Changing what? The trust. I stared forward, unmoving. Mason kept talking, words spilling out faster now. She said Dad wanted updates done years ago. She said legal documents needed changes. She said you didn't want to worry me. Every word hit harder than the last, because I could hear it now. Not manipulation, not greed, trust, blind trust. The kind husbands give wives, the kind sons give spouses. Mason continued quietly. Mom, Claire said she was helping. Helping. I looked toward Arthur's photograph sitting on the bookshelf, and suddenly I remembered something he once told me after one of Mason's high school girlfriends cheated on him. Mason loves people completely. That's beautiful. Then he'd smiled sadly. But complete trust can become dangerous. I finally spoke, very softly. Mason. Yeah. Come over. Silence. Then, what? Come here. My voice stayed calm. No anger. No accusation. No tears. Just calm. Right now. Another pause. Mom, why? I looked at the laptop screen. Paused there. Claire leaving my house with Arthur's envelope in her purse. I stared at her smiling face. Then whispered, because there's something you need to see. Mason arrived 25 minutes later. I watched his car pull into the driveway from the living room window. Rain still fell outside. Not hard anymore. Just a light steady drizzle that covered the street in silver reflections. For a moment I simply stood there, looking at my son. He sat inside the car for several seconds before getting out, hands still gripping the steering wheel, head lowered. I had seen that posture before. Years ago, when he was 16 and had backed Arthur's truck into a mailbox. He'd sat exactly like that, trying to gather courage before walking inside, trying to prepare for consequences. Funny how some things never change. I opened the door before he reached it. Mason looked exhausted. His eyes looked tired. His face looked pale. Mom. I stepped aside. Come in. No hug. No smile. Just silence. He followed me into the living room. I don't understand what's happening, he said finally. I looked at him carefully. Really looked at him. This wasn't the same man from Thanksgiving dinner. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. Only confusion remained. Sit down. He sat slowly. I handed him a cup of coffee. He stared at it but didn't drink. Then I walked upstairs, into Arthur's office, picked up my laptop, came back downstairs. Mason frowned immediately. Mom. I sat across from him, opened the computer, pressed play. First he looked confused. Then I watched his face change. Hallway footage. Mason entering. Claire behind him. Unlocking my office. Searching drawers. Opening files. Taking photographs. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Mason stared at the screen. Completely still. The color slowly drained from his face. Then came the second video. Claire entering my house alone. Claire walking upstairs. Claire leaving with Arthur's envelope. Still no words. Still silence. I watched my son's eyes. Shock. Confusion. Then realization. Terrible realization. No. Barely a whisper. No. He leaned forward, staring harder, as if watching it longer might somehow change what he was seeing. It doesn't make sense. I stayed quiet. It doesn't. He stopped, because suddenly he saw it. The missing envelope, the purse, the key, everything, every piece finally connecting. Mason sat back slowly, then covered his mouth with his hand. I had never seen him look like that before. Not after Arthur died. Not after losing jobs. Not after hard times. Never. Because heartbreak looks different when someone destroys your trust. Especially when the person beside you in bed is the one holding the knife. I didn't know. His voice cracked. Very softly. I swear to you, Mom. I believed him. That surprised me. After everything, I believed him. Not because he was my son. Because I had seen his face. Seen his confusion. Seen him searching for answers. I reached over and touched his hand. He looked up. Eyes full of tears now. Real tears. I'm sorry. I smiled sadly. Oh, sweetheart. He lowered his head. I should have asked questions. Yes. I should have come to you. Yes. I should have trusted you. I squeezed his hand gently. Then I said the thing that had been sitting inside my chest for days. I didn't freeze your trust fund because I stopped loving you. Mason looked at me. I held his eyes. I froze it because I finally realized someone was using your name. Silence filled the room. Then he whispered, Claire. Not a question. Just a broken truth. I nodded slowly. Outside, rain had finally stopped. Sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Small pieces at first. Tiny pieces. Arthur used to love moments like that. He'd stand by the window and smile. Storms end, Evie. Eventually they always end. Mason sat beside me quietly. Neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to. Because some losses don't happen when people leave. Some losses happen when illusions leave. And sometimes, losing an illusion is the first step toward getting your family back. Bottom of form, top of form, bottom of form.